You came back! Yay! All right, this is my third video in my videos that highlight basic glazing technique. So we've done underglaze, we've done basic overglaze, like single color overglaze. Let's talk about using more than one overglaze together in one piece. This can be a little bit dangerous because, as I've said, if two glazes overlap, where they overlap, you're going to see a different effect there. So you can't just slap glaze on and then be like, oops, I got some of this red glaze on my blue background, and then put more blue on top of the red and expect it to get covered up. You will see that in the end. So when you're putting more than one glaze onto a piece, you need to be really careful where those edges are. So this video will go over that. This is the piece that I made to demo for you. I'm not super happy with the outcome, and there's a little more contrast than I anticipated. But you know what? That's okay. Somebody else might really love that contrast in this piece. What's really important in this process, if you choose to put more than one color on, is that you really take your time and you're super careful on your edges. Have some fun. You can do some interesting things with this technique. We've got the basics of how to glaze. We've talked about glazing in textures and how to push those into textures. Let's talk about how to glaze if you're using more than one color of overglaze. As I've stated before, when two colors of overglaze overlap, once it's fired, those will mix. So you'll get this weird overlap space. So what you have to do is be exceedingly careful on any edge where two different colors meet. I've already gone in and I've done 3 coats on the inside of my vessel because we've learned that that's a good idea to do before proceeding to other areas. When I work with more than one color glaze on an object, I usually start in the background or the color that's furthest back, and I build towards the colors in the foreground. So I'm going to start by layering in the glaze in the sky. I'm going to use Mako Element Sea Spray for that. It's a nice, really, really light blue, so I think it'll set back. So I'm going to start by layering in 3 coats of the sea spray. I'm going to use 3 coats because it's a thinner glaze and it has more transparency. I'm going to be really careful with the brush strokes for that reason, and I'm going to make sure that my brush strokes, as much as possible, flow with the direction of the sky. When I come up to edges, I'm just going to kind of push that glaze right to the edge and really work carefully around it. Be careful in this step to avoid getting any of your glaze on the top of any of the other surfaces. You also want to make sure that you push that glaze up the edge of each of these objects, as it's really hard to glaze down the edge of objects. Take your time, pay attention to your brush strokes, and be careful. At this point, I've gone around and I've done 2 coats. My second coat was pretty heavy, so I feel confident that 2 coats will be enough. And what I was doing in my second, or my last coat if you were doing 3, is I used a really small brush, and I want to make sure that I've gotten into these crevices right around these different objects. So I'm taking quite a bit of glaze and kind of forcing it into each edge, making sure it crawls up the edge of the object just a little bit, so that when I glaze the object on top, the cloud or the tree or the leaf in this example, I don't have to get glaze down around the edge, because it's really hard to glaze the skinny edge without getting the glaze on that background. So I'm just going to finish my coat on this layer, and then we'll talk about the next step. You'll notice that I'm adding the glaze quite heavily here. Be careful not to get too heavy with your glaze, or when it melts in the kiln it can drip, and that can be devastating. So be careful. Now that I've got the background done, I'm going to go in and I'm going to glaze the next thing that comes forward at me. So the closest things are my leaves. That'll be the last thing I glaze. The trees, and then the clouds. So my clouds are my next step. So I have a glaze I'm going to use with the clouds. I'll shake it up. And then before I start glazing those clouds, I want to take a wet paintbrush, and I just want to go around and look at each one. And if I've got any of the glaze from the blue on that cloud, I'm going to take my wet paintbrush and I'm just going to kind of resaturate it and brush that blue off so it doesn't show through that layer. So I just go around, double check everything that I'm going to glaze, and if I see a spot like this where there's a little bit of that blue I don't want, I'm just going to take that brush, saturate, and just kind of use the brush to pull the glaze off. Once I've done that, I can start glazing those clouds. What I want to be careful of in this step is not to get anything on, well, what I want to be careful of in all of the next steps is not to get any of that on any of my glaze onto spaces that I've already finished. If I do get it in those spaces, I can clean it up. It's just a little tricky, and you run the risk of being able to see some of that color coming through later. For the clouds, I'm going to just do 2 coats. I'm going to work it up under the edges of any trees or leaves that it comes up into contact to, just like I did with the sky. And I'm going to avoid getting it on the blue of the background. So I'm going to take my time here and layer up slowly. In this step, I'm also being careful to make sure I get my white glaze around the edge of each cloud and up the edge of the things next to it. All right, I've got all of my clouds glazed. I ended up doing just one really thick coat on each cloud. I don't want to put too much glaze on where it's going to, when it melts, drip. So I didn't put a second coat because I really felt confident that first coat was sufficient, and I didn't want to overdo it. So at this point, I'm now going to glaze the trunks on the 4 trees that I have here. I'm going to be using copper Aventurine, which is a dark brown color, and I'm going to need to be pretty careful with it because if it gets on this blue or the white, it's really going to cause some issues. Before I add the copper Aventurine, I need to make sure I clean up the blues that got onto my trunk, and then I'm going to put 2 thin coats of this on. It's a really dark glaze. I don't want to put it on too heavy and have it drip. Take your time and be careful, my friends. I have gone in and glazed 2 coats on each tree trunk. I got a little bit on this tree here, so I wiped it off. You can see there's a little bit of a stain left. And now I'm ready for my last color. I'm going to use this Mako Elements Autumn. I really like how it picks up this texture. I'm going to put 2 coats of this on the top of each tree and on all the leaves. And I'm just going to be really careful to get it right up to those edges, working all the way around. On the bottom of my vessel, I have 4 feet. This is the only place the vessel touches the surface. So I'm going to make sure to keep my glaze off the bottom of the feet, but I will be able to glaze the space in between. All right, so what I did here is I laid down a heavy coat of glaze in the middle of each of these objects. Once I had the whole middle covered, I came in with a really small paintbrush and I carefully edged out each and every leaf and the edge of the tree. I brushed that thicker edge into the center of each piece, and then I layered up another heavy coat in the middle. This gave me a really clean edge on this top layer, and it assured that I had a nice coat on everything that I did. Take your time, folks. This is a tricky step. All right, I have finished. I've got 2 layers of glaze on all of the leaves. I've glazed the bottom. I've cleaned off the feet. I've got to do just another little bit of a scrub. A little bit of glaze on the bottom. You can see there's just like a film of it on the bottom of these feet. Isn't going to stick to the shelf, but I should get them a little bit cleaner. I'm double checking that I don't have any glaze anywhere I don't want it. I don't have any little blobs anywhere. I also want to make sure that I'm looking at it from different angles to make sure all my edges are good. And if I notice that there's areas on my piece that are missing glaze, I'll go in with a little brush and just touch it up. But at this point, it's done and ready to go into the kiln. I'll show it to you when it's all finished. Here is the end product. And I'll be honest with you, this autumn fired quite a bit darker than I was anticipating, and I'm just gonna roll with it. I can either leave it like this, or if I really want to try something different, I could put another layer of glaze, just one, on the whole thing and refire and just see what happens. Maybe bring it together a little bit more. The contrast between the autumn and the sky right now is just a little bit more than I would like. So I either leave it and have it turn out in a way that wasn't quite what I anticipated and accept it, or I can do one thin layer of one glaze color. If I did that, I'd probably use the autumn, cover the whole piece with the autumn, see if I could get the sky to darken up a little bit, and just kind of embrace what happens at that point. It's kind of, when my students have a piece like this that it comes out of the kiln and they're like, I don't really like it, it wasn't what I anticipated, you've got 2 choices. Choice 1 is to accept it and leave it where it is, which is a perfectly fine option. Choice 2, depending on how much glaze you have, is you can put 1 coat over the whole thing, refire it, and see what happens. Sometimes you'll get a piece then that you really like, and sometimes it'll get to a point that you like it less. And it's really, your question is, how much do I dislike it? Do I dislike it enough that I'm willing to make it worse? Or is it just not quite as ideal as I would like? And that kind of drives your next step. The other reason you wouldn't want to put another coat on is if potentially you already have quite a bit of glaze, where a second coat is going to cause some dripping issues, which would mess up the bottom, which wouldn't be ideal either. So I've got some decisions to make on that, but you can see how the outcome turned out.